So welcome all to the final session of today, which is focusing on data gaps and their implications. So we've moved, first of all, from a focus on policies and how they relate to pro-poor growth, then to an interrogation of the numbers themselves and a particular focus on the new World Bank numbers, which have just been released. And so now we're going to move to question data gaps and what they imply about poverty measurement. So my name is Emma Salmon. I'm a research associate here at ODI with the Growth, Poverty and Inequality Program. And data has been a key focus of a lot of our work over the past couple of years. We've been actively involved in work around the data revolution that's been called for alongside the Sustainable Development Goals, and more recently on implementing the Leave No One Behind agenda, which is a fundamental part of the SDG outcome document. And so the panel today combines both of these areas in addressing the question of different types of data gaps and what they mean for poverty reduction. And so we'll be looking at questions such as what are the gaps in what we know about poverty, how can we fill them, and how can we make pro-poor policy even where we know that there are gaps in the data. So there's different types of gaps that we will be focusing on, and our speakers will be addressing different elements. First, we'll be looking at gaps caused by our conventional way of gathering data on who is poor by considering who may be typically excluded from household surveys and censuses. We'll then move on to consider how politics in particular affect our interpretation and acceptance of data by focusing on the case of Pakistan, which is the subject of a recent ODI case study, and where data from the last couple of decades on poverty are quite heavily contested. And then third, we'll move on to think about how governments are dealing with data gaps in practice and what steps they're taking to fill these gaps. So our speaker from Mexico will speak to how the government is addressing data gaps relating to poverty, particularly disaggregated data, and what will be needed moving forwards. And then our speaker from Sierra Leone has been involved in a recent post-2015 data test, which seeks to assess what monitoring the SDGs will mean for selected low, middle, and high-income countries. And so he'll speak to the gaps that this initiative has identified in Sierra Leone and also as to how governments make policy in practice where data are missing. So just a couple of comments about the structure of this session. First, I'll ask each of our speakers to speak for 10 minutes, as we've done in the other sessions. So Professor Rory Carhill will speak first, followed by Amina Khan. After that, Eduardo Clark will join us from Mexico via video link, after which Nat Wellington will be joining us by telephone. And so both Eduardo will need to leave shortly after his presentation, and Nat Wellington in Sierra Leone will also only be able to stay on the line a short while. So we'll have the presentations, questions for each of our remote speakers, and then open the floor to more general discussion. So first of all, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Rory Carhill. Rory Carhill is a professor emeritus at the University of York and also holds a position in education in developing countries at the Institute of Education. He has, in the course of his career, he has taught at the University of Sussex. He has worked at the OECD in the Social Affairs Division, where he was a co-author of their initial publication on measuring social well-being. He's also spent time in Mozambique teaching statistics as well as anthropology and educational planning. So, Professor Carhill, could I invite you to please give your remarks?
Okay, thank you. Where's the clicker?
The clicker, yes, here it is.
Which one is it?
Yes, I think that's right.
This is about the fact that at least nearly all the poverty estimates we have are based on household surveys of some form or another. And my estimate, they're missing between 300 and 500 million of the poorest of the poor, which means that the actual poverty gap is much larger than any of the estimates we're talking about. I haven't seen it move. I did it wrong.
Let's have a look.
That one? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
The UN data revolution, I won't go on about it, but it's just focused on data equality and on missing information on access to data. But that's not what we need to do. We need to focus on the fact that we don't know how to cover the poorest in the populations. We just simply don't know how to count. The issue about not being able to count in general has been raised, not by me at all, but raised about 25 years ago by Powell arguing for the refunding of the International Institute for Vital Statistics and Registration, which fell away from funding about, 20 years ago, I think. But neither of them, and none of those writers have talked about or realised that the majority of those who are missing, the vast majority, are the poorest of the poor. It's an international public scandal. It affects between 250 and 500 million in developing countries, and I think those are low estimates. So I'm going to look at I'm going to give revised estimates of what the progress has been since 1990, and talk about and explain how that comes about, and then make some vague suggestions of what we could do. Now, the general problem that consensus are not always themselves necessarily complete is well understood. It's not just developing countries. The US, for example, doesn't know how to count its people in the military. Do they count them where the barracks was or where their home was? An obvious example. The typical problem groups in developing countries are housekeepers, are they counted? The mobile, including nomads, homeless and institutional populations like care homes, hospitals, military, prisons and refugees. Household surveys clearly can't cover those. They're just, and censuses don't in general count prisoners in UK or US. They count, we've got 80,000 in UK, but we haven't got a clue who they are because we don't count them that way. The household surveys, clearly if there's a problem with the national census, then if it's used as a sampling frame, then that will lead to that sampling frame being biased. And even if the survey uses block sampling or GPS, which, say, for example, Bangladesh does, there are additional problems both by design and in practice. By design, household surveys, and I had to say this when I first raised this 12 years ago in the bank, I had to say this very slowly because I was talking to pretty stupid people. They miss out those who are not in households because they are homeless. Now that's, you'd have thought was pretty obvious. It took me about an hour to explain that. Those who are in institutions, e.g. refugee camps, but then there's military, hospitals, care homes, all over, right? Mobile, nomadic or pastoralist populations. In practice, if you've ever done a household survey in a developing country, you'll sympathise with this. They typically underrepresent many who are difficult to reach. Those in fragile, disjointed households, e.g. households with HIV, where it's a kid is the head of the household or it's grandparent headed, they're often missed out. Those in urban slums, don't know the last time any of you tried to do a survey in a real deep urban slum. It's quite difficult to actually know how many people are where and what they're doing, let alone drawing a sample of them. Those in insecure areas of the country, unrecognised servants, stroke inverted commas slaves, and older women in Sahelian countries tend to be missed out. It's a tradition. It's quite a lot of subgroups, and nearly all of them are poor, very poor. Obviously, it's not easy to make precise estimates of numbers in some of those groups. In the institutional groups, we have more or less exact figures. The only thing, a slight problem is that refugees, of course, aren't all in refugee camps these days. They're wandering around the Schengen area, unknown where they are, and we won't ever know. But then in other institutional groups, we do know the numbers. We don't know anything more about them, but we know the numbers. We can make estimates of the number of nomads because there's been several studies, and a guesstimate is there's somewhere around 70 or 80 million. All of whom, by the way, couldn't care less about income poverty because all they care is how many cattle they've got. Then there's the homeless. There are wild estimates of the numbers of homeless, which UNICEF have made and continue to make. But there are homeless, but just how many there are, it's a bit difficult to estimate. The biggest category probably is the urban slums. I've always thought it's amusing that the UN office which is concerned with that issue, Habitat, it gave an estimate there are about 1 billion in urban slums in 2003, and they give the same estimate now. Now, I think urban areas have grown over the last 12 years. I don't know where I get that from, but I think they have. And I don't think there's been massive housing redevelopment. Most of the slum areas I've been to, you don't notice massive housing blocks being built. They're more in Dubai rather than in the slums of Mumbai. So I just don't know, but I'm guessing that a small percentage of those in urban slums just aren't included in a household survey. They might just about be included in a census. Bangladesh, for example, does GPS and to identify households in urban slums, but that doesn't tell you how many people are underneath the roof, of course. The original poverty estimates were that it reduced from 60%. There was my estimate is a reduction is from about 60% to 53% in 2015. I have 7% fall from a higher baseline than the 9% fall from 56% to 47%, which was trumpeted by UNDP. Assessments of progress since 1990 need to take into account the increasing numbers of missing people. I'm saying increasing, just thinking of refugees and, as I say, urban slums. It seems to be the obvious places where there'll be very big increases. The effects are large. They're growing faster than the visible. 95% of the population, this is according to UN Habitat, this is not me, 95% of population increase expected in the first 30 years of the 21st century will be absorbed by urban areas, the less developed regions. Population likely to rise from about 2 billion to 3.5 billion. An awful lot of that will go into urban slums, not into high-rise buildings. Refugees or highly mobile populations in general, I'm thinking of travellers and others, almost certain to increase more than proportionate to the world population. GPS will help, counting roofs, but much systematic effort is needed into estimating the numbers missing and into methods of correcting estimates to account for these seven missing groups. Okay.
Okay.
Probably less than 10 minutes, but it doesn't matter.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. We'll revisit the discussion subsequently. Thank you. Okay, well, let me invite now Amina Khan to continue, who is going to speak to us about a recent report of which she is the lead author on our understanding of poverty in Pakistan and the various issues that have made this such a contested thing. Amina is a research officer here at ODI in the Growth, Poverty and Inequality Program. So yes, Amina, please take the next 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Emma. Could I please have the...
Of course.
remote?
Could I just take the...
Thanks. So first of all, good afternoon to all present in the audience, as well as to our attendees online. And second, a very heartfelt thank you to all the authors involved in this study, Arif Naveed from Cambridge University, my colleagues at ODI, Mozia Server, Chris Hoy, and to you, Emma. To the internal reviewers, Susan Nicolai, Kate Bird, and Katie Harris, and our external reviewers, GM Arif from the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, and Ludovico Carraro from Oxford Policy Management. In this presentation, we will explore the politics of accepting data, poverty reduction in Pakistan. Our findings, as Emma mentioned, are based on Development Progress Project's case study, Progress Under Scrutiny. Pakistan appears to have reduced poverty. To what extent is this progress real? Let's take a quick look at these two figures on the percentage of people living below the official national poverty line in Pakistan on the left, where the poverty headcount seems to have dropped from 25.5% in 1992 to 12.4% in 2010, and the percentage of people living in extreme poverty based on the $25 in 2005 PPP terms on the right-hand side seems to have fallen from 65% in 1990 to 13% in 2010. It isn't very easy to subscribe to these figures in the Pakistan context. Interviewing several stakeholders from the policy and research community, as well as from civil society, we find a wide range of views and a concomitant use and misuse of statistics in support of these views. Some are adamant that official figures are misleading, or indeed that poverty has increased. Others insist that they are not misleading, the reduction is real, poverty has decreased. Stakeholders who claim that official statistics are not misleading and that poverty has decreased over time cite the extreme poverty data, if you see the left-hand side of the first infographic, and the fall by 52 percentage points in extreme poverty over the 20-year period. The drivers of poverty reduction they mention include, among others, the transformation of rural areas, a dynamic informal sector, the inflow of remittances into rural areas and small towns, an increase in female labor force participation in the agriculture sector, the extension of microfinance to rural inhabitants, women and the poor, and, in the second infographic on the left-hand side, increased spending on social welfare from $216 million in 2001 to $7.3 billion in 2011, and in particular to the Benazir Income Support Program. These are indeed positive developments, but we cannot link them causally to a decrease in consumption poverty in Pakistan. Stakeholders who claim that official statistics are misleading and that poverty has increased over time state that economic growth in the 90s and after 2007 has not been pro-poor. And as shown on the right side of the first infographic, the data on real GDP growth per person they cite falling on average between the early 90s and the late 2000s by 1 percentage point. They present a host of reasons for their skepticism, that improvements in the official poverty figures do not tally with other indicators of well-being, that prices soared after the global food crisis of 2006 and recession of 2008, with the cost of everyday staples doubling, as shown on the right side in the second infographic, that ongoing energy deficits have dampened productivity, and that the Benazir Income Support Program has been targeted ineffectively. They also maintain that the wider political context and geopolitical motivations to support the war on terror have perpetuated conflicts, displaced thousands of people, weakened law and order, and driven down investment and employment. These are indeed worrying developments, but we also cannot link them causally to an increase in consumption poverty. The evidence cited is partial at best, and the story of progress surprisingly inconclusive. We can say, though, that alongside the technical flaws in the official evidence base and other compelling evidence that we review independently of the views of the stakeholders, their accessions do cast reasonable doubts over the stated reduction in poverty. Some of the key technical flaws in the official evidence base include the quality of the data on consumption. Official poverty estimates in Pakistan rely on consumption data on food and non-food items from the Household Integrated Economic Survey, HIES. Before 1998, the HIES was conducted on its own. In 1998, it was merged with the Pakistan Integrated Household Survey, PIHS, to consolidate the collection of socioeconomic data. There were two notable changes to the way in which consumption was measured in this combined survey. First, expenditures in the combined surveys module were recorded in less detail. Second, the reference period of consumption was changed from monthly consumption to fortnightly consumption for most food items. In India and Tanzania, such changes have made huge differences to poverty estimates. Pakistan has also not conducted a national census since 1998, so the survey frame is outdated, and this will bias poverty counts. Pakistan's population has grown much faster than the projection based on the 98 population census. In the 2010 highest round, the population was estimated to be 130 million, whereas Pakistan's economic survey produced by the Ministry of Finance as a State of Economy report cites a figure of 177 million people for that same year. If this is correct, as many as 47 million people are missing from the calculation of official poverty statistics. The third, the use of the Consumer Price Index to adjust the official national poverty line. Food weights in the CPI, derived from a 2007 family budget survey that is now outdated, covers only cities and urban markets and underestimates household spending on food. Higher expenditure on food in rural areas, combined with low weighting given to the food shares in the CPI in high food price periods, is likely to underestimate rural as well as overall poverty in Pakistan. Lack of government confidence in its own estimates is also a key compelling source of evidence. Although Pakistan's poverty estimates have been verified repeatedly by organizations and agencies like the UN Development Programme and the World Bank, the government itself lacks confidence in them, as shown by the fact that official sources cite their own current official estimates as interim. They caveat that a technical group has been tasked to review the official methodology and to identify possible causes of variance in the figures, reinforces this lack of confidence and fuels stakeholder disagreement. Implications. Pakistan demonstrates the difficulty in presenting official poverty estimates when the data and the mainstream narrative are so contested. It highlights the fact that data is political as well as technical, and that any proof of progress needs to be defensible, verifiable, and acceptable to a wide variety of key stakeholders. Without broad stakeholder consensus and the necessary buy-in, in particular from those outside of government, doubts will continue to loom over the official figures and will reinforce the state of ambiguity over Pakistan's progress in reducing poverty. However, an improved official and credible evidence base will unlock this impasse and will help move the country towards a more convincing story of progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for a very interesting country-specific example, looking at both technical and political issues, and for keeping perfectly to time. We are, in fact, ahead of time. So let me now turn to Eduardo Clark, who is Data Director for Development at the Office of the Presidency of Mexico. So Eduardo, would you like to please give us your thoughts?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Okay, great. Well, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you, ODI, for the invitation. I think it's been an interesting past two panel proposals. So let me start by saying that Mexico has advanced pretty tremendously over the last decade to generate better estimates on the poverty that we suffer in the country. So in the last decade, we have consolidated the autonomous role of INEGI, the National Statistical Office, and we have also generated a council for the official measurement of poverty. It's also a technically autonomous council that is in charge of doing the official estimations of poverty and margination in Mexico, to remove some of the usual political tensions that arise from offices that do this measurement. While these two instruments rely on mostly on household surveys and on the census exercise, they still provide some very valuable information. The problem that arises from them is not on the reliability of their sources, even if they do present some of the caveats that Professor Clark presented with household surveys, such as the potential to exclude some very vulnerable populations that might be moving around the country and that are hard to capture correctly within the surveys. But the main problem that we have has to do with the opportunity of the results that are presented. So, for example, municipal level results on poverty and estimations on poverty, which are crucial for decision makers, are only presented every 5 years after census exercise. So the last estimates that we have to do with 2010 data, and were presented in 2011, while the new estimates on municipal level poverty and margination should be available next year after an exercise this year. While state and national level poverty estimations have less of an issue with opportunity because they come around every 2 years, they still provide very large time gaps for different decision makers to create policy that tries to impact directly on the reduction of poverty. So the big question is, how can we generate estimators in those intermediate moments so that we can inform policy making? There's always a big trade-off in this part, especially because the estimations generated by INEGI and by the CONAVAL, which is the Poverty Measuring Council, are very, very careful exercises that try to increase the reliability of their estimations and make the best estimations possible. While they're very valuable, as I was saying, they're not very opportune in some instances. So the trade-off always comes between trying to choose less reliable measurements or indirect measurements that you can get in more opportune moments, sometimes closer to the actual data being generated, and waiting for the other estimates. So what we're trying to do within the Office of the President has to do with how can we find as much information in administrative sources generated by different government agencies all across the federal government and sometimes across local governments to provide the tools necessary for decision makers to try to analyze the poverty situations in the particular uh, areas of influence without having to wait for the official results. Of course, it's always dangerous because when you choose less accurate indirect measurements such as administrative data, this data may sometimes go in another direction of the official estimates. But we still believe that providing the most information as possible still generates good outputs and good outcomes for policymakers and also for people outside government to understand the situation in different geographic areas within Mexico. In this context, we are pushing very strongly the open data policy within the office. The idea being that there's a wealth of information in the different areas of government activity within Mexico that can be put out there for government officials inside government and also for people from outside government to use. And let me just provide a couple of concrete examples. For example, if we're trying to look at consumption in areas that are very traditionally associated with poverty, instead of while we wait for the official estimates, we can also look at indirect measurements. In Mexico, we have the particularity that all public electricity belongs to a parastatal company, the Federal Electricity Commission. And the idea here is that we can generate very timely estimates of electricity consumption in Mexico that we can publish with only a month or two lag that can give us an idea of how consumption of electricity is happening in some very rural areas. While this is a non-100% accurate measure, it gives us a good idea of how economic activity and consumption may be moving around some areas of the country. So the whole point of the open data policy is trying to find some of these data sources that are sometimes hidden within government agencies and trying to put them out there so that people can make indirect measures and get a better idea with more opportunity about the situation in the country. In this sense, this year, at the beginning of 2015, we published a presidential decree that states that all data should be open by default, and we started by open by default and available online in open data formats. And the work that we're doing right now with all the agencies is pretty much one by one going with them and trying to see what data sources they have, and through discussions with open organized civil society and with different government agencies, seeing what data should be out there and in what formats and what type of disaggregation that we can put it out there without without compromising personal data. So another example that we're using that might be interesting for the estimation of consumption, or at least for income, is instead of waiting for, while we wait for income surveys, we also have access to social security databases for Mexico. So Mexico has a couple of social security schemes, mainly the IMSS and the Seguro Popular. The IMSS covers people that work in the formal sector, and the Seguro Popular covers people that are outside the formal sector. But when you enroll for either of those, there's a lot of information that they require from you. In the side of the IMSS, which is the formal sector, it's linked to your payment. So with those data records, you can see how different sectors of economic activity in Mexico are assigning wages to their employees. And on the side of the Seguro Popular, there's for enrollment, which is open for all. There's also there's an enrollment procedure that asks for information on work and income. So it's information that sometimes attacks some of Mexico's most vulnerable population because it has to do with social security for the people outside the formal sector, and it's information that we can use to estimate income in areas that are very marginalized and from people outside the formal sector, and that sometimes we cannot catch. So in a nutshell, what we try to do within the office in this part is trying to provide more tools, even if they're less reliable than the official estimators, so that different stakeholders can use them and generate better insight and try to help us deal with the issue of extreme poverty in Mexico. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So yes, very interesting, both in terms of reflections on the timeliness and need for disaggregated data, and of course the use of data from multiple sources, both formal and informal. Now, I understand that Eduardo is going to need to leave us soon, so could I ask if we have any questions which are...
Actually, I can stay, so don't
Oh,
worry.
you are able to stay, so are you able to stay for the whole of the session if we postpone questions
Yeah.
till... Okay. Then,
that's
in
fine.
that case, we have Mr. Nat Wellington joining us by telephone. Okay, not yet. We will have him joining us by telephone. So let's take an initial round of questions then, and then perhaps we'll pause for the last presentation once he's available. So yeah, let's start with the gentleman over here.
Hi, I'm Miker from King's College London. My question is for Eduardo, and the question is, in practical terms, what is the relationship between the presidency office where you work in and the Coneval, which is the institute that measures poverty in terms of data?
Okay, thank you.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay.
But
Well, thank you for the question. In practical terms, we have a good relationship, but especially with Coneval and INEGI, we try to keep an official distance because we want the estimations that are generated by Coneval and INEGI to remain the more technically autonomous as they can. So while Coneval and INEGI are part of the open data policy, in the sense that they provide us inputs that we put over to the open data policy. That's the relationship that we have with them, and we try to work closely to see what they need and what other government sources we could open that they could be able to use more easily. But on the side of the estimates that they generate, they function completely autonomously from us. Does that address your question?
yeah. Do we have other questions? Okay, let's go Claire, and then, yes, I may jump in and ask a question as well.
Yeah, my question is for Professor Carhill. I thought that was it's a really interesting presentation. As you know, we've used this research extensively at ODI and find it very compelling. I just wonder, in terms of fixing the problem, I mean, you had a number of interesting examples of, use of satellite imagery and different ways in which this could be fixed. I wonder if there are also sort of deeper methodological fixes in terms of our methodologies around surveys, and just what you thought about Francis Stewart's idea in the previous panel about having some sort of international commission on measuring poverty that was separate from any of the operational agencies whose job is to do something about it. I hadn't thought about it fully, but that seemed to me quite an interesting idea that could merit a bit more examination.
Let's take a couple more questions before. Let's take this gentleman and then over there.
I just like to, because I thought this was data session, but then because I really wanted to ask the question how measuring poverty is difficult in itself, but measuring extreme poverty, which is very important, I didn't see until now any discussion what are the specific ways that you're going to measure the extreme poverty, the ultra poor, which is an aim of the SDGs, and which is really difficult to capture, as we have heard. So, is there any way that we're going to do it? Can you suggest any ways? Are there anybody doing it? That sort of thing.
Okay, and let's take the question over here as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Rod Dubitsky from BRAC. I had a question on, given the large percentage of poor that are in smallholder farmers and in rural areas, the particular challenges of measuring poverty among smallholder farmers who consume a large part of the crop that they produce, so staple crop farmers, versus measuring it with farmers that produce cash crops, so the cocoa coffee farmer versus the maize rice farmer, and then relatedly rural employment that is off the books. Will we pick this up in consumption measures of poverty, or is income measures of poverty able to pick this up? Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could just jump in with a question too for both Eduardo and for Amina, which is basically you've both raised interesting government initiatives with in terms of responding to data gaps, the Technical Commission you mentioned in Pakistan is tasked with reviewing and coming up with some sort of consensus on poverty and how it's changed over time. And Eduardo, this move towards open government and this impetus for combining data from many sources. And I just wondered if you could describe where the impetus in both cases has come from, the impetus behind this open data movement in Mexico and in Pakistan for this revision of the poverty data. So yeah, let's perhaps ask each of our presenters to respond.
I mean, it is obviously difficult to do it, but I mean, it isn't as though there aren't methods. If you go through, if I go through the groups, we can count refugees, but the trouble is we can only count the refugees who are in UNHCR camps. Of course, if we think about it, it doesn't have to think about that very much to realise that's a bit silly. And my guess is there's at least double, and it's probably increasing. For example, almost for entertainment, I looked at, given the UK is one of the best monitored countries in the world, not the best, but one of the best, how many are missing in the UK from household survey estimates? It's about 1.5 million. You just wouldn't believe it. I mean, you really wouldn't. And I couldn't believe it myself when I did the numbers. And to do that, I did double the official number of refugees we have, but I think that's a reasonable estimate. On the but of the groups and nomads, I think we do know how to, not only roughly how many. I think there are methodologies out there for surveying nomads. I've done a household survey of nomadic population in Somalia, one of the most difficult places in the world, you would think, to do it, and that was 6,500 households, and I think it was pretty representative. Yeah. We know the numbers of institutions, so the real institutions, we know those. And obviously they're all poor. Prisoners, well, not all, so prisoners are. The military, no. The UK and European and US military are not poor, but the military of other countries probably are poor. But outside the institutional populations, it's Bangladesh, and I think India does a bit of GPS satellite imagery in the urban areas. But I said they don't know how many people are under each roof. So that's one version. I myself, for example, I was thinking of raising it for Pakistan. I've done a survey in slums in Pakistan, and that's different from the DHS. When they go to a household and no one replies, they just go away. Okay? I've been back several times and different times of the day, or got my interviewers to do that, and find people there. They're not empty. They just don't want to answer the door. So there is that of kind of persistence would help, but from other magic bullets, I can't think of any other magic bullets. I mean, it's so the other tack I've tried is saying, well, could we statistically going back to essentially your question, could we statistically estimate? And the one the trouble is, no one's given me funding to do this. I know it's bizarre, but no one will fund it. I'm not quite sure why. I've looked at DHS surveys, and if you just do something obvious, like look at the child mortality rate by income, I mean asset-based income, not income, then the curve doesn't do what it should do. In general, it should get steeper at the bottom. The more you get into extreme poverty, the more things get relatively worse. But they don't. On the whole, rather like some of those graphs we had earlier, they flatten out at the bottom. That's all wrong. That's just all wrong. And that's true for about 20 countries I've looked at. And so what I've done is I've said, well, look, let's not believe this. Just straighten them out. Just straighten out. Instead of being in fact at the bottom, let's just straighten them out. And doing that produces numbers similar to the numbers I'm saying. In fact, it produces larger numbers. So that there is those kind of approaches. Now, I'm getting too old now to do too many fancy statistics, but I'm sure it could be done to make some statistical estimation using reasonable assumptions about how the curve should go on education and income or mortality and income or whatever it is. And so I think there are some, and yes, I would agree entirely with Francis Stewart. There has to be, I mean, it's a real tragedy that International Institute of Vital Statistics was just collapsed with lack of funding. Because in the end of the day, the donors haven't bothered. Not really. I mean, I know there are programs now about improving statistics in Africa and Asia. I know that. but it's not the same thing. That's improving their ability to actually computerize and use and get their data in a usable, at least for us, if not by themselves. But it's not the same thing as coverage. I mean, if you look at the census documents of developing countries, with rare exceptions, and Bangladesh and India are exceptions, if you look at there's very little metadata. If you look at our census report, for example, they'll tell you we've gone back and done a follow-up survey, and we agree we can't find the homeless, etc. It goes into all those things. So do most of the European censuses. But these don't. They don't even tell you they didn't go to some areas because they're insecure. I mean, that's pretty. So we have very little information about the census gaps, little of household surveys. So it's that could be, I'd have thought, something that could be a concentrated program to do that. That would help if we even knew what the gaps, where the gaps are, let alone not how many there are. If we knew where they were, it'd be a start, right? And at least I agree with Francis on that. So have I answered your question? I mean,
more about how do we estimate the number and location of the ultra poor?
well, as I said,
the poorest of the poor.
yeah, I know. The suggestion I had about messing around with the graphs of DHS surveys, and then you can do it by their region or province or whatever. Or
You see, the deaths are not recorded often of children. The poorest of the poor.
no, I know that. Yeah, I mean, well, the only solution I've heard of for finding out about deaths in countries is to do a cemetery count. On the hop, but I'm not sure that really is. I've certainly heard people advocating that a cemetery count is to find out about deaths, but I'm not sure that really works. It only works in urban areas anyway. The DHS does ask about child mortality, but if they aren't covering the poor, it doesn't help. Child mortality in the last 2 years. So does mix. And what is astonishing about that, and worth knowing about any of those, is that if you compare child mortality reported by DHS with administrative estimates, they're not far out. I mean, they're not very close, but they're not far out. But if you look at child morbidity reported by DHS, its relationship to education, let's say, is the wrong way round. So its data on child morbidity is useless, completely useless. It's the wrong way round, very obvious reasons. Health is a luxury good. So, of course, the more educated the mother is, the more she'll report diarrhea of the kid in the last week. As opposed to the poor don't. The poor is just so common, they forget about it. But I think the way round for estimating is the statistical way, I think. Very rough estimates there'll be, but it will be estimates.
Thank you. Sorry, did you want to
Yeah,
say?
that's it.
Yeah, thank you. So should we go on to Eduardo and Amina, please? Perhaps Eduardo, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. So a lot of the impetus that we got to start doing this had to do with Mexico becoming a part of the Open Government Partnership, which actually we are the co-chair this year, and we have the official conference for that later next week. But I think that one of the things that really pressured us into doing this was one of those commitments that we took as when we joined the OGP. So the Open Government Partnership is when you join as a country, you have to set forward a set of commitments. And one of those was to generate an open data system. And while we worked on that, we really found a lot of avenues to do a lot of work. And while at the beginning it was just a commitment, nowadays we're very committed, but because we really truly believe in the value that providing a lot of data out there can really help. So as Professor Clark was saying, I think it's really important to provide. There's a lot of difficult questions that can only be answered statistically and through indirect estimates. And even if they're rough estimates, it's better having some information, even if it's general ballpark, than not knowing anything at all. So that's what we're trying to do, and trying to collect as much information as we can to trying to find ways to solve problems in some innovative solutions.
Okay, thank you. Amina, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. So I'll start with the question about the impetus as well, because it's a nice follow-up. So Pakistan has had several technical groups over many decades now, and even in the 90s, and especially in 1998, when there was discussion about setting up an official national poverty line, which they didn't have before. It was done individually by certain researchers and then taken on by the government, saying that, okay, fine, this is a good methodology, we'll use. For example, the 1990 figure that Pakistan has for the 26.1%, which I didn't cite here, I said 25.5% in 1992. It's based on a different methodology, but appears in all official documents. And many stakeholders also don't pick this up. What's interesting is that with this technical group on poverty that's there now, they're going to present some recommendations in 2016. And it's not coincidental that these have, it's a corollary of events. There's going to be a population census in 2016 with some of the issues that I mentioned, the technical nature, whether it's the coverage of the CPI, they're considering whether to extend it to rural areas. They're thinking about the sampling frames based on the new census for the household surveys to reflect the demographic and social changes that are happening in Pakistan between 1990 and 2016. It's dramatically changed. So the technical group is aware of these challenges, but what's interesting is that even though people in government do set up these technical commissions, to what extent do their recommendations get the necessary buy-in from politicians is a completely different matter. That's where the politics of acceptance of data is very key. The timing of release of poverty estimates is also very key. And this technical group is also not apolitical. They have their interests and the necessary influence over the last 20 or 30 years. They've been measuring poverty, analyzing poverty in multiple ways, and then also have a stake in the policies to reduce it. So because they have their foot in many different camps, it's very difficult also to juggle what is technical and what is political. And if we sort of say that data is inherently technical and political, then again, we've just brought them so together. When do you stop and start? It's very challenging for them as well. So,
One point I forgot.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. For example, there are some techniques which we can use in our countries. For example, the homeless. The ONS does a count of the homeless by walking around the street at night. Let's see. There are other ways. I don't know if you know how we count foxes. You stand at a tree, you paint all the foxes that come one day, go back a week later, and you look at the proportion of the ones you catch the second time round who are painted. If it's 10%, then you multiply the numbers of foxes by 10. Now, I've done that in York, the equivalent. I've gone to the reception centre for homeless. Haven't painted them, obviously, but just checked who they were. And the numbers I've estimated for York, now York's a very stable city and and everything, many times the declared numbers. Now, again, it's a question of finding and deciding to do it, but I can't see actually that being done in Dakar or Mumbai, frankly. I think it'd just be too difficult. And the biggest problem is urban slums, and I just really don't know, apart from recruiting local committees, but I really don't know how to do it. Yeah.